lost their minds when they bought a tiny cabin in the middle of a winter forest. But one strange night, and a shocking discovery beneath the floor turned their lives upside down and revealed a secret that had been hidden for decades. Subscribe to the channel and comment which city you're watching this story from. The announcement came on a gray morning when even the sky seemed tired of pretending that anything would ever change. The radio in the break room crackled as it always did, its battered speaker humming with static that no one had bothered to fix in years, and then the familiar voice of the local host, usually so careful to sound cheerful, faltered. He read the statement twice, as if the words themselves were too heavy to carry on the first attempt. The last factory in the Northern Industrial District was closing, effective immediately. There would be no severance packages worth the name, no miraculous investor riding in at the last second, no reopening under a new brand. The heart of the city was simply being switched off. For the twins, it felt less like news and more like the end of a sentence they had been trying to finish all their lives. They had grown up in the system, moved from one foster home to another, learned early how to keep their heads down and their hands busy. The factory had been their anchor. It was not glamorous work, but it was steady. They knew the rhythm of the shifts, the smell of oil that clung to their clothes long after they left the building, the ritual of lining up their boots by the door of the tiny room they shared in the workers' dormitory. They had imagined that if they endured long enough, something better would come. A promotion, a training course, at the very least, a sense that tomorrow would look like today. When the supervisor gathered them around later that morning, his eyes were red and he avoided looking at anyone for too long. He spoke of market pressures, of restructuring, of how he wished there were another way. The words were hollow, but no one argued. By noon, the machines were already silent. Men and women wandered the floor like ghosts, touching cold metal as if it might answer them back. The city reacted as if someone had died, which, in a way, was exactly what had happened. The lunch lines at the factory cafeteria dissolved in a matter of hours. By evening, pawn shops were glowing with new life, their windows filling with drills, laptops, wedding rings, anything that could be exchanged for a few days of breathing room. Landlords began to talk about raising deposits, about new requirements, about how they could not risk renting to people without jobs. In the bus that carried the twins back to the dormitory, no one spoke. Every face was turned inward, calculating losses, imagining futures that grew smaller with every passing stop. For the twins, the descent was swift. Their savings evaporated under the weight of overdue bills and minimum payments that refused to shrink. Collection agencies found their numbers within a week, polite at first, then insistent, then coldly threatening. The dormitory, once an unremarkable building that had at least provided shelter, was suddenly sold to a developer who promised loft apartments and boutique cafes. Notices appeared in the hallways announcing that all residents had 30 days to vacate. There were no exceptions, no alternatives offered, just a date stamped in red ink, as final as a verdict. They tried everything. They answered ads for rooms that turned out to be scams or required deposits they could not afford. They stood in lines at shelters only to be told that all beds were full. They swallowed their pride and asked acquaintances they barely knew, only to be met with uncomfortable smiles and excuses about lack of space. The city had turned into a closed circle, everyone protecting what little they had left. The night before they were due to leave the dormitory, they sat on the thin mattresses in their bare room, surrounded by cardboard boxes and trash bags stuffed with the remnants of their lives. The walls were already marked with the ghosts of furniture that had been sold off piece by piece. Neither of them wanted to be the first to say it, but the word homelessness hovered between them like a bad smell. They were not afraid of the cold or of work. They were afraid of becoming invisible. It was the younger of the two who stumbled across the listing. He had been scrolling aimlessly through his phone, the way people do when they are trying not to think, when a photograph caught his eye. It showed a small triangular building, half buried in snow, perched at the edge of a forest. The caption was brief to the point of being suspicious. Tiny cabin for sale, as is, remote location near protected land. Cash only, price to move. The number attached to it was so low that he refreshed the page, certain he had misread. They stared at the image together, zooming in, trying to make sense of it. The cabin looked like something out of a holiday card, but there was something off about it. It was too neat in some places, too neglected in others. The angle of the roof was strange, almost aggressive, and the snow around it was untouched, as if no one had walked there in years. Yet the door seemed solid, the frame reinforced. It was not the ruin they had expected to see for that price. The seller was evasive when they called, speaking in rushed fragments as if he were afraid to linger on any detail. He mentioned zoning issues, access problems, how the place had been built years ago for reasons that no longer mattered. When they asked why it was so cheap, he laughed nervously and said that nobody wanted a shack in the middle of nowhere, especially not with winter coming on like this. He urged them to come see it before someone else did, though his tone betrayed little faith that anyone else would. Word spread faster than they could contain it. A former co-worker posted a screenshot of the listing to a local group, adding a line about how the twins had finally lost their minds. By the time they scraped together the money and signed the papers, their faces were already circulating online. People speculated about how long they would last, whether the roof would collapse under snow, whether wild animals would claim the place before the cold did. The mockery stung, but it also hardened something in them. If the city was determined to laugh them out, they would leave with their heads high. The journey to the cabin was a trial in itself. The road narrowed from cracked asphalt to gravel and finally to a rutted track barely visible under the growing drifts. Their borrowed pickup shuddered with every bump, the engine whining in protest as the forest closed in around them. At a certain point, they had to abandon the vehicle and carry their belongings the rest of the way, breath freezing in their throats, hands numb despite the gloves they wore. When the cabin finally emerged from the trees, it felt unreal, like a set piece waiting for actors who had not yet arrived. Snow piled against its walls in uneven drifts, softening its sharp lines. A small plaque above the door bore a symbol they did not recognize, half hidden by ice. For a moment, they simply stood there, the wind pressing against them, and wondered if they had made the worst mistake of their lives. Inside, the air was stale but not entirely dead. There was a faint scent of old smoke, of wood that had once been warm. The space was barely large enough for two people to stand without bumping into each other, but the construction was solid in ways they could feel under their fingertips. The walls were thicker than they had expected, layered like something built to endure more than just weather. As they set their boxes down and coaxed a small fire to life in the stubborn little stove, a strange quiet settled over them. The laughter of the city was far away now, reduced to a memory carried on frozen breath. They had nowhere else to go, no one left to appeal to. Whatever this cabin was, whatever secrets it held or disasters it promised, it was theirs. And in the dim orange glow of that first fragile flame, They understood that the story of their lives had just taken a turn none of those watching screens could have predicted. The first night in the triangular cabin did not bring the relief they had secretly hoped for. Even as the stove crackled and the thin walls began to hold a fragile pocket of warmth, the cold seeped in from every angle, crawling across the floorboards and up their legs like a living thing. The fire seemed to fight back, flaring and dying in uneven breaths, and they took turns feeding it splintered pieces of wood they had scavenged from a fallen fence half buried under snow. Outside, the forest pressed close, its branches groaning in the wind, as if curious about the strangers who had dared to settle in a place so clearly designed to remain empty. By morning, exhaustion clung to them heavier than their coats. Their breath still fogged the air when they spoke, and the tin cup of water they had left near the door had a skin of ice across its surface. They realized quickly that nothing here would be simple. Snow had to be melted for every wash of the hands, every swallow of water, every pot of thin porridge they forced themselves to eat to keep their strength. The nearest store was miles away, along a road that could vanish beneath drifts in a matter of hours. They wrote lists on scraps of cardboard torn from their boxes, counting how many cans they had, how much rice, how many matches. Survival became arithmetic. When the signal flickered back to life on one of their phones, it brought the city with it like a disease. Their faces stared back at them from a dozen feeds, framed by the sharp angles of the cabin roof. Someone had driven out, snapped pictures from the road, and posted them with captions that treated their new home as a joke, a curiosity for bored eyes. People debated whether the structure was even legal, whether it would collapse, whether the twins were reckless or simply stupid. A few comments offered pity, but even those were tinged with spectacle, as if they were characters in a show rather than men trying to stay alive. The attention was a double-edged blade. On the one hand, strangers offered to drop off supplies, though always with a camera in hand and an expectation of gratitude. On the other, the exposure felt dangerous. A spotlight they had never asked for in a place that had promised invisibility. They argued about whether to shut their phones off entirely, whether silence would protect them or simply make them easier to forget. The cabin fought them at every turn. The stove smoked no matter how carefully they arranged the wood, leaving soot on the ceiling that drifted down like black snow. The chimney coughed sparks into the night, and they took turns standing outside with a bucket of slush, afraid that a single stray ember might turn their last refuge into a funeral pyre. They stuffed rags into the gaps between boards, tore up an old blanket to wedge into a crack that whistled whenever the wind changed direction. Still, the cold found them. It was during one of those endless nights, when the walls popped and groaned under the pressure of dropping temperatures, that they began to notice the house itself behaving strangely. One corner of the floor never seemed to freeze. No matter how the fire died down, how far the chill spread, that patch remained stubbornly warm, as if it were hoarding heat for reasons of its own. They brushed it off at first, attributing it to the stove or some trick of insulation, but the pattern repeated, precise and undeniable. There were other things too, sounds that did not belong to wood expanding or ice shifting. A dull metallic click that echoed faintly from within the walls when the temperature plummeted. An odor that drifted through the room when the fire burned low, not the comforting smell of pine or smoke, but something sharper, like old iron left too long in the rain. Their nerves, already frayed by hunger and exhaustion, turned these details into obsessions. They traced the interior with their hands, pressing against the planks, listening for hollow echoes. They argued about whether they were imagining it, whether the cabin was simply settling after years of neglect. But the feeling persisted, that the building was not as simple as it appeared, that it was layered around something hidden. The stress brought old wounds to the surface. One of them accused the other of dragging them into this madness, of clinging to a fantasy of proving the world wrong instead of finding a safer way out. The response was sharp, reminding him that there had been no safer way, that the city had already turned its back. The fight left them both shaking, not with anger, but with the terror of recognizing how close they were to losing not just their shelter, but each other. And yet, amid the mockery, the fear, the relentless cold, they found moments of stubborn triumph. They patched the roof well enough to stop the slow drip that had been staining their only table. They learned the precise rhythm the stove demanded, the angle at which to set the wood so that the flame would climb instead of suffocate. The cabin warmed, fraction by fraction, until it held them through the worst hours before dawn. In those moments, when the fire burned steady and the forest outside lay hushed under a blanket of snow, they felt something close to pride. The city might have been watching, laughing, waiting for them to fail, but here in this improbable triangle of shelter they were still standing. And beneath their feet, in that stubbornly warm patch of floor, something waited, patient as the winter itself, ready to change everything they thought they knew about the place they now called home. The warmth in the corner of the cabin refused to behave like the rest of the room. No matter how carefully they rationed wood or how fiercely the cold raged outside, that single patch of floor remained different, a quiet anomaly that mocked the logic of their survival routines. At first, they tried to ignore it, convincing themselves that the uneven heat was nothing more than a quirk of the stove's position or a pocket of insulation the builders had accidentally made too thick. But as the days dragged on and the nights grew harsher, the mystery of it began to gnaw at them in a way hunger never could. One morning, after a night when the wind had hammered the cabin so hard they had feared the roof would lift clean away, the younger brother knelt to retie his boot and felt it again through the thin sole. The boards there were not just less cold, they were almost warm, as if the floor itself were breathing out a secret. He called his brother over, pressing his palm to the wood, and they exchanged a look that held more unease than relief. In a place where nothing came easily, unexplained comfort was a threat. They tried to map the warmth, moving a candle slowly across the planks and watching how the flame leaned, how the air seemed to shimmer faintly above the surface. The patch was small, barely wider than a suitcase, and it did not spread when the fire roared or shrink when it died. It was constant, stubbornly indifferent to the rest of the cabin's struggle against the cold. The decision to tear into the floor came reluctantly. Every board was part of a fragile balance they had fought to establish, and opening the structure felt like tempting fate. Still, curiosity and fear had woven themselves too tightly to be untangled. They cleared the area, stacking their few possessions against the far wall, and let the stove die so that sparks would not leap into the open wound they were about to create. The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable, the kind that amplifies every breath. When the first plank came loose, it released a puff of air that smelled faintly of rust and old paper. Beneath it lay a layer of insulation, packed tighter than anywhere else in the cabin. They worked slowly, fingers numbing as the cold rushed back into the room, peeling away the stuffing until the tip of a pry bar struck something that rang with a hollow, metallic note. They stared at each other for a long moment before levering it into view. A rectangular metal box lay embedded between the beams, its surface mottled with age, but unmistakably manufactured. Faded seals clung to its edges, stamped with dates from the early 1990s, and remnants of paper labels hung like shed skin from its corners. It did not belong here, under the floor of a novelty cabin sold for the price of a few months' groceries. It was too deliberate, too carefully hidden. They wrestled it free, breath steaming in the frigid air, and set it between them on the bare boards. For a heartbeat, neither dared touch it, as if the box itself were charged with the weight of whatever history it carried. When the lid finally creaked open, the sound seemed to echo longer than it should have in the cramped space. Inside lay rows of audio cassettes, their plastic cases clouded with dust, each marked with dates, initials, numbers that meant nothing, yet felt heavy with implication. Beneath them were bundles of paper secured with twine that had long since lost its color, diagrams traced in fading ink that mapped flows of money through shell companies and accounts that no longer existed. At the very bottom, folded until the creases had become permanent, was a list of names, each followed by a brief notation that made the room seem suddenly smaller. They did not need to read every word to understand the nature of what they were holding. The names were not accompanied by addresses or phone numbers, but by terms that spoke of erasure rather than record. Gone. Closed. Unresolved. The cold they had been fighting for weeks crept inward, settling somewhere deeper than their bones. The first instinct was denial. Perhaps it was nothing more than the detritus of some forgotten project, the relics of a time when people had stored everything on tape. But as they spread the contents across the floor, patterns emerged. Company logos they half recognized from old signs in town, references to a mine that had once been the city's pride, shut down after a bitter privatization that locals still discussed in lowered voices. The sense of being watched, of having stumbled into a room they were never meant to enter, grew with every page. They hid the box again, sliding it back into the cavity and replacing the boards as carefully as they could. The warmth returned almost immediately, as if nothing had been disturbed. But the cabin felt altered, no longer merely a refuge from the cold, but a container for secrets that had outlived the city that birthed them. That night, sleep eluded them. They lay listening to the wind scrape at the walls, to the distant groan of trees bending under ice, and beneath it all, they imagined they could hear the faint echo of those metallic sounds from within the floor, a reminder that the past was not content to remain buried. The mockery of strangers online seemed trivial now compared to the quiet menace that had taken root in their home. Whatever story the box held, it was no longer content to stay silent, and they were beginning to realize that finding it had bound them to consequences far greater than surviving another winter. The box beneath the floor had changed the temperature of the cabin in ways the stove never could. Even with the fire roaring, the space felt colder, not in degrees, but in meaning, as if the walls themselves were absorbing the implications of what lay hidden under their feet. For 2 days, they avoided touching it again, busying themselves with the mechanics of survival, chopping wood until their arms shook, melting snow in dented pots, pretending that the anomaly in the corner of the floor was nothing more than a trick of construction. But every time one of them crossed that patch, he felt the echo of metal through the boards, a reminder that something in this place had been designed to outlast ignorance. It was the younger brother who finally broke the stalemate. On a trip into town to barter a few tools for canned food, he wandered into a junk shop that smelled of oil and dust, its shelves sagging under the weight of obsolete technology. He did not go there looking for anything in particular, but when he spotted a battered tape recorder behind a stack of cracked monitors, his pulse quickened. The owner eyed him with mild suspicion, then shrugged and named a price so low it bordered on charity. The machine was heavy in his hands, its plastic casing yellowed with age, but it felt like a key. Back at the cabin, they cleared a space on the narrow table and set the recorder between them like a fragile relic. They fetched the box from its hiding place, prying the floorboards up with a care that bordered on reverence now, and laid the contents out in neat rows. The tapes seemed smaller than before, almost delicate, their spines marked with a faded ink that blurred at the edges of meaning. They hesitated, not because they feared the mechanics of the device, but because of what the first click of play might unleash. When the tape began to turn, it did so reluctantly, whining as if it resented being disturbed. Then came the hiss of static, a brief silence, and finally a voice that was too calm for the words it spoke. It was not a dramatic voice, not the kind that belongs to villains and stories, but a measured, bureaucratic tone that stripped the horror of its disguise. Names were spoken, dates recited, phrases about agreements and compliance woven together with something darker that lurked between the syllables. They listened without speaking, the room filling with a presence that had not been there moments before. They stopped the tape after only a few minutes, both of them aware that their hands were trembling. It was one thing to read a list of names, to see abstract references to money and transfers. It was another to hear a human voice dissect a life with such casual authority. The cold that settled in their chests did not fade when they pressed stop. In the days that followed, the recorder became a constant companion, its clumsy buttons worn smooth by repeated use. They rationed the tapes the way they rationed food, listening to one in the morning when their minds were clear, another at night when the darkness outside felt like a mirror of the darkness in the recordings. Patterns emerged slowly, like a map revealing itself through fog. The same companies surfaced again and again, their names changing slightly as if trying on disguises, while the same individuals drifted through the conversations like shadows that refused to solidify. They began to cross-reference what they heard with what they could find online during the brief windows when the signal reached the cabin. Old news articles, archived court filings, forgotten blog posts from grieving relatives who had once shouted into the void. The privatization of the mine, which the city had accepted as an inevitable evolution, took on a different shape under their scrutiny. Deals were mentioned in the tapes that had never been public, transfers of land that had occurred in the dark, a cascade of shell companies that funneled wealth away while leaving the community to choke on dust and broken promises. The list of names became their ledger of ghosts. One belonged to a union organizer who had vanished the year the mine was sold. Another to a local accountant whose family still placed flowers by an empty grave every winter. The annotations beside them were cruelly concise, a shorthand of erasure that made no attempt to soften its intent. The brothers found themselves speaking those names aloud, not as part of the recordings, but in their own voices. A quiet act of defiance against the neatness with which they had been crossed out. One afternoon, while snow piled against the windows in thick, soundless sheets, they noticed something that made the cabin feel suddenly smaller. Amid the jargon and financial codes on one of the tapes was a reference to a location, spoken almost casually, as if it were merely another file number in a system that had long since lost its soul. It was not a street address or a company office, but a phrase that matched the symbol above their door, the one half hidden by ice. They replayed the segment again and again, each time more certain that the place being discussed was their cabin, that the triangular shape and remote location were not quirks of design, but deliberate choices. The realization settled over them like a second winter. The cabin had not simply been abandoned to rot until two desperate men stumbled upon it. It had been built to serve a purpose, to hold something that others did not want found, to wait in silence until the world forgot it existed. The warmth in the floor was no longer a curiosity, but a warning sign, the physical trace of a past that had been sealed away but never resolved. They debated what to do with this knowledge, their conversations circling the same points until they were dizzy with them. One brother argued that they should walk into the police station with the box under his arm and let the authorities take responsibility. The other countered with the names they had uncovered in their research, names of officials who had risen through the ranks in the same years the tapes were dated, men who now posed for photographs at charity dinners and campaign events. The thought of placing their fate in such hands made his skin crawl. As the archive took shape in their minds, the cabin itself seemed to react. The metallic clicks in the walls grew more frequent, or perhaps they were simply more attuned to them now. The strange smell that drifted through the room when the stove burned low sharpened, carrying with it a hint of paper and rust that reminded them too vividly of the box beneath the floor. Even the forest outside felt different, less a refuge and more a boundary, a reminder of how far they were from anyone who might help. Still, curiosity pulled them onward. They created their own crude map of the conspiracy, sketching connections on the backs of grocery receipts, tracing the movement of money from account to account, life to life. The work was exhausting, not just mentally but emotionally, forcing them to confront the fact that the city that had discarded them was built on foundations far darker than unemployment and neglect. One evening, when the recorder chewed a tape into a tangle of plastic ribbon, they laughed for the first time in days, a short, brittle sound that startled them both. They fixed the machine with the same stubborn patience they applied to the stove, and in that act of repair there was a flicker of the resilience that had carried them this far. They were not investigators by training, not heroes in any story they had known, but the archive had chosen them all the same, had wrapped its secrets around their lives until escape no longer seemed possible. By the time they slid the last tape back into its case that night, the cabin had ceased to be merely a shelter from the cold. It was a vault now, an archive in its own right, holding within its narrow walls the echoes of vanished lives and unfinished crimes. The twins lay awake long after the fire died, staring at the ceiling as if they might see the outlines of those stories etched into the wood. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, a different kind of weather was gathering, one that would not pass with the turning of the season. Winter arrived in earnest the night the cabin began to sound like it was tearing itself apart. The storm rolled in without ceremony, a wall of white that swallowed the forest and pressed against the thin triangle of their shelter with relentless force. By dusk, the temperature had fallen so fast that the air inside the room crystallized on every surface, a fine dust of frost creeping across the table, the walls, even the edges of the tapes they had been listening to earlier that day. The stove roared until its metal glowed dull red, yet the cold found cracks no matter how carefully they had sealed them, driving its invisible knives through every seam. They had learned the language of the cabin by then, the usual creaks and pops that came with deep frost, the hollow booms when ice shifted on the roof. But that night, woven through the familiar noises, was something else. A ringing that was too clean to be wood, too resonant to be the casual clatter of loose nails. It sounded once, then again, each time echoing faintly from the same section of the wall where they had earlier traced the strange symbol above the door. Neither of them spoke. They sat with their backs against the opposite wall, watching the shadows dance as the fire fought to stay alive, waiting to see if the sound would return. When it did, sharper now, like metal striking metal deep within the structure, they knew sleep was impossible. Whatever had been hidden in the cabin did not intend to remain quiet forever. Morning arrived in a bruised gray light that barely penetrated the storm. Snow lay piled halfway up the door, sealing them in a world reduced to the size of the cabin. They ate in silence, their thoughts circling the same question neither wanted to ask. At last they pulled on their coats and began to peel back the interior wall where the sound had come from, working carefully to avoid compromising the fragile balance they had fought so hard to establish. The first layer of boards came away with surprising ease, revealing insulation packed more densely than anywhere else in the cabin. Their fingers ached as they dug through it, the cold biting even through gloves until the tip of the pry bar struck something unyielding. When they cleared the last of the padding, a smooth steel surface emerged from the timber like a fossil from rock. The safe was not an afterthought. It was embedded into the wall itself, reinforced by extra beams that spoke of forethought and intent. This was not where someone hid valuables in a hurry. This was where something had been placed to wait. They searched the frame for a lock, finding instead a series of numbers burned into the underside of a supporting beam. The marks were subtle enough to pass as construction notes to anyone not looking closely, but now that they had been drawn to this part of the cabin, they stood out like a signal fire. Their hands shook as they dialed the combination, half expecting the mechanism to scream in protest or refuse to turn at all. Instead, it yielded with a soft click that seemed to reverberate through the entire structure. The door swung open to reveal a neat, almost reverent interior. Stacks of old banknotes lay bound in paper bands that bore the insignia of institutions that no longer existed. Beneath them were folders thick with original documents, contracts, and deeds stamped and signed in ink that had not yet faded. They recognized names from the tapes, from their own frantic research, now elevated from whispers on plastic to tangible proof. At the back of the safe sat a small hard drive, its casing scratched but intact, labeled with a date and a series of letters that meant nothing and everything at once. There were other items, too, ones that seemed out of place among the paperwork. A key taped to a scrap of paper bearing a bank's logo. A hand-drawn map with a single point circled in red. These were not keepsakes. They were tools, parts of a system designed to move people and money out of sight when the need arose. They sat on the floor for a long time. The safe's contents spread between them like the aftermath of a crime scene. The cabin, which had once felt like a miracle of cheap shelter, now pressed in on them as a carefully constructed trap. The recordings in the box under the floor had hinted at corruption, at violence carried out in quiet rooms far from public scrutiny. The documents in the wall made it undeniable. This place was not an accident. It was a node in a network that had devoured lives and then erased the evidence. Fear settled into them with a weight that eclipsed the cold. If the people who had hidden this material were still alive, if they had ever intended to return, then the twins were not just squatters in a forgotten cabin. They were trespassers in someone else's unfinished business. Every footstep in the snow outside, every distant engine noise suddenly sounded like the beginning of an ending. They debated their next move in low, urgent voices, the fire snapping between them like a third participant. One of them argued that they should put everything back and pretend they had never seen it, that survival meant choosing which dangers to face. The other countered that pretending was no longer possible, that the knowledge itself had already altered the terms of their existence. In the end, they compromised by dividing the contents, hiding the cash and most of the documents back in the safe, sealing the hard drive in a waterproof pouch and burying it under the floor where the metal box had first emerged. It was a mistake born of desperation. In their haste to protect what they had found, they made the first move that would draw unwanted eyes to their world. A single anonymous post appeared on a classified site that afternoon, offering a collection of vintage tapes to any serious buyer, no questions asked. They told themselves it was a way to gauge interest, to see how far the ripples would spread. They did not yet understand how fast such ripples could turn into waves. By nightfall, the storm had eased, leaving behind a silence that felt artificial, like the pause between two notes in a piece of music that never truly ends. They lay awake, listening to the cabin settle, to the faint creak of beams adjusting under the weight of fresh snow. Somewhere in the wall, the safe waited, as patient and inscrutable as the secrets it guarded, while outside, in the city that had already forgotten them once, forces older and more dangerous than winter began to stir. The storm receded, but it left behind a silence that felt staged, as if the world were holding its breath. In the days that followed the discovery of the safe, the twins moved through the cabin with the care of men crossing thin ice. They spoke less, listened more, and flinched at every sound that did not fit the familiar pattern of their fragile life. The classified post about the tapes had seemed harmless in the moment, a whisper into the void, but it did not take long for the void to answer back. The first sign was a car. They noticed it from the narrow window that faced the dirt track winding through the trees, a dark shape that had not been there an hour before. At first, they assumed it was one of the well-meaning strangers who had been following their story online, curious enough to brave the forest for a photograph. But the vehicle did not approach. It sat at the edge of sight, engine idling just long enough to fog the cold air and then falling silent, as if whoever was inside were content simply to be seen. When it disappeared, they tried to convince themselves it had been nothing. But the snow betrayed the truth that night, preserving a pair of boot prints that led too close to the cabin to belong to anyone lost. They circled the structure with a flashlight, the beam carving pale tunnels through the dark, finding a broken twig under the window, a shallow indentation in the drift where someone had knelt to look inside. The forest, once a wall of indifferent trees, had become a crowd. Their phones, so unreliable in the depths of winter, began to misbehave in ways that felt intentional. Messages failed to send. Calls dropped at the exact moment one of them tried to describe what was happening. And, when the connection did come through, it carried with it things they had not asked for. An empty text, a missed call with no number attached, a voicemail that contained nothing but the sound of breathing before cutting out. They tried to act normal, driving into town for supplies when the road allowed, nodding at the cashier who no longer met their eyes, lingering over coffee in a diner that had once welcomed them without question. It was there, in the warped reflection of a window darkened by steam, that one of them noticed the same man twice in a single afternoon, first in line behind them at the counter, then later across the street pretending to adjust a camera he never raised. The man's face was forgettable in the way professionals cultivate, but his gaze lingered a fraction too long. The sense of being hunted followed them back into the forest. The cabin door creaked open to a smell of cold metal and wood smoke, and they stood inside without moving for several heartbeats, waiting for the house to betray any sign of intrusion. Nothing appeared disturbed, yet something felt wrong. A drawer that did not slide as smoothly as it had that morning. a tool placed back on its hook at the wrong angle. It was not theft, it was reconnaissance. That night, they heard movement outside after midnight, the careful crunch of snow that belongs to someone who knows how to walk without drawing attention. They did not light the stove. They did not breathe until the sound faded into the trees. By dawn, the classified post they had placed had vanished, reported and removed, replaced by an email that arrived without a subject line. The message was polite to the point of menace, expressing interest in the tapes and suggesting a meeting at a location just outside town. They were not naive enough to believe in coincidence anymore. The archive had been quiet for decades, waiting for someone desperate enough to buy the cabin that hid it. Now that it had been disturbed, the past was reasserting its claim. The warning came from an unexpected quarter. On a supply run, they noticed a flyer tucked under their windshield wiper, its edges damp from melting snow. It advertised a community meeting about the old mine, a subject that had not drawn more than a handful of attendees in years. On the back, written in hurried script, was a single sentence telling them not to trust anyone who mentioned the tapes. There was a phone number beneath it. The man who answered spoke in fragments, as if he had learned to compress his thoughts into the smallest possible space. He had lost his brother during the privatization, he said, a man who had been vocal about the sale and had vanished on his way home from work one night. He had spent years trying to pry information from people who now wore expensive suits and spoke about economic revitalization on television. When he mentioned the triangular cabin in the forest, the twins felt their blood turn to ice. It had been a waypoint, he said, a place whispered about among those who knew how to listen, a storage site for things too dangerous to keep in offices that could be searched. He urged them not to go to the meeting proposed in the email, not to answer calls, not to assume that the police would act in their interest. There were still men in town, he said, who had made their fortunes during those years, men who would do anything to keep the details buried. Then he hung up, leaving behind nothing but the echo of his warning and the certainty that their isolation was an illusion. The escalation was swift. One afternoon, as they returned from town, they found the door to the cabin ajar, a thin wedge of darkness where there should have been a tight seal. Inside, nothing was missing, yet the feeling of violation was profound. The floorboards above the hidden box bore fresh scuffs, and the insulation in the wall near the safe had been disturbed, pressed back into place by hands that knew exactly where to look. They were no longer dealing with curiosity. Someone had come searching. It was only a matter of time before the searchers grew bolder. On the next trip for supplies, a truck pulled out behind them as they left the main road, following at a distance too consistent to be accidental. They turned off early, heart pounding, and watched in the mirror as the truck slowed, hesitated, and then continued on, its driver apparently satisfied that the message had been delivered. The forest that had once seemed endless now felt like a cage. Every tree was a potential hiding place, every bend in the path a blind corner where their luck might finally fail. They locked the cabin at night and slept in shifts, one eye always open, a hatchet within reach. The mockery online had faded, replaced by a silence that was more frightening than laughter. They had become interesting to the wrong people, and interest, they were learning, could be lethal. In the midst of this tightening circle, the words of the man with the missing brother took on new weight. If the people who had engineered the mine's downfall were still close enough to exert pressure, then the twins were standing on a fault line that ran straight through the heart of their city. They were no longer simply trying to survive winter. They were custodians of a history someone had spent a lifetime trying to erase, and the cost of that custody was rising with every passing day. By the time the twins accepted that the forest was no longer merely a backdrop but an arena, the cabin had already begun to change in their minds. It was still small, still cold, still maddeningly fragile in the face of winter storms, but it had also become a line drawn in the snow, a place they would defend not because it was comfortable, but because it was all they had. The presence that had circled them since the discovery of the safe was no longer an abstraction. It was measured now in boot prints and engine sounds, in the way their phones faltered at critical moments, and the way strangers in town watched without seeming to watch at all. They worked with the quiet urgency of men who understood that time was no longer theirs to waste. The first changes were simple but transformative. They reinforced the door with a brace cut from a fallen beam, wedging it into place each night so that it would not yield easily to a single shove. They cleared a narrow path through the snow behind the cabin that led into a thicket where the trees grew close enough to swallow a person in a dozen steps, a last resort should the front be compromised. Every modification was a risk to the integrity of the structure, but risk had become the currency of their days. The contents of the safe and the metal box were divided with a care that bordered on ritual. They sealed the hard drive in a double layer of plastic, wrapped it in cloth, and buried it beneath the warm patch of floor, trusting the anomaly that had revealed the box in the first place to hide their most valuable asset. Copies of key documents were photographed and stored on an old memory card, the only digital lifeline they dared to create in a place where the signal flickered like a dying pulse. The tapes were split between them, half hidden in a hollow tree beyond the clearing, half tucked behind the wall panel that still bore the faint marks of the safe's discovery. At night, the cabin felt smaller than ever. They slept in shifts, one man's dreams never quite deep enough to mask the slightest change in the air. The wind no longer sounded like weather, but like footsteps, and the distant howl of animals blended too easily with the memory of engines idling in the dark. They spoke in murmurs, their voices absorbed by a wood that had learned too much to give anything back. The psychological toll of this new vigilance was heavier than the physical cold. Old grievances, sharpened by exhaustion, flared at the smallest provocation. One brother accused the other of courting disaster by insisting on exposure, on dragging the truth into the light when it might be safer to sell what they had found and disappear. The reply was raw with conviction, a reminder that they had already been disappeared once by a city that had discarded them without ceremony. To walk away now would be to accept the role written for them, to become another pair of names that might one day surface in some forgotten archive. It was in the midst of this strain that they found the name that crystallized everything. Buried in the hard drive, in a ledger that took hours to decrypt, was a record of transfers that led inexorably to a man whose face was still familiar in town. He was the kind of figure people referred to as respectable, a patron of local charities, a regular at civic events, someone who spoke eloquently about renewal and the future. The same initials appeared again and again in the documents, anchoring the web of shell companies and off-book accounts to a single, still-living node. The discovery robbed them of the last of their illusions. This was not a story that ended with the collapse of the mine or the passage of decades. It was ongoing, threaded through the present as surely as it was rooted in the past. The man's influence explained the hesitation of the police, the evasiveness of town officials, the way certain subjects were still avoided in public despite the passage of time. It explained why the classified post had not vanished into nothing, but had instead summoned a response from people who knew exactly what the tapes represented. They reached out to the one avenue that felt less compromised than the others, a journalist whose work had once exposed a housing scandal in a neighboring county. Contact was made through a series of convoluted steps designed to leave as few footprints as possible, a chain of borrowed phones and half-remembered email addresses that ended in a single encrypted message. They did not attach anything at first, only a promise that they possessed material related to the mine's privatization that could not be ignored. The reply, when it came, was cautious but unmistakably real. The journalist asked for proof, not the whole trove, but enough to establish credibility. The twins argued over what to send, weighing the need to be believed against the danger of revealing their hand. In the end, they chose a single document and a brief audio clip, stripped of identifying details, and transmitted them during a rare window of strong signal, their hearts pounding as the progress bar crept forward. The error that almost undid them came from the cabin itself. In their haste, they failed to notice that one of the insulation panels near the safe had not been seated properly after their last inspection. The next morning, fresh snow bore the imprint of a hand where someone had brushed against the wall, testing it, probing for weakness. It was a small thing, easy to miss, but to men already living on the edge of panic, it was proof that the search was closing in. That afternoon, as they stood in the clearing discussing their next move, headlights cut through the trees at the far end of the track. The vehicle did not approach, did not retreat, simply idled long enough to announce its presence before vanishing back into the forest. The message was clear. They were no longer being observed from a distance. They were being measured. The cabin held them that night like a clenched fist. They sat on either side of the stove, the fire casting their faces in alternating shadow and light, and spoke of things they had not dared to articulate before, of leaving town forever, of names and places that might accept them if they survived this winter, of the possibility that doing the right thing might cost them everything they had fought to preserve. The documents lay between them, mute and accusing, a testament to the lives that had been erased so that others could smile for cameras and cut ribbons at grand openings. By the time the fire burned low, they had reached a decision that felt less like a plan and more like a commitment. They would not sell the archive. They would not hand it to anyone who came knocking in the night. Whatever the cost, they would find a way to place it in the hands of those who could not afford to ignore it. The cabin, for all its cold and creaking boards, had become more than shelter. It was their stronghold, the last line between the past that had been buried and the future that demanded to know it existed. The forest did not sleep the night they made their choice. It shifted and murmured beyond the thin walls of the cabin, as if the trees themselves were aware that something irreversible had been set in motion. The twins sat across from each other at the narrow table, the stove's glow barely strong enough to soften the hard angles of the room, and felt the weight of the archive press on them from every direction. It was no longer hidden simply beneath floorboards or inside a steel box. It had taken residence inside them, altering the way they thought, the way they breathed, the way they imagined a future that now refused to look anything like the past. They had already rehearsed the arguments so many times that words felt redundant. One path was clear and seductive in its simplicity. There were people who would pay handsomely for silence, who would make the twins disappear into a new life with enough money to erase the cabin, the city, even the memory of winter. It would be a transaction like any other in a world that thrived on transactions. The other path was far less certain. It led through exposure and chaos, through forces they could not control, toward a reckoning that might consume them along with those they sought to unmask. In the end, it was not heroism that tipped the balance, but exhaustion. They were tired of being erased, tired of watching the city hollow itself out while pretending everything was fine, tired of surviving on scraps of warmth and borrowed time. Selling the archive would have bought comfort, but it would have also bought silence, and silence was the one thing they had been drowning in all their lives. They prepared in stages, treating each movement as if it might be their last in the cabin. The hard drive was duplicated onto 2 small memory cards scavenged from broken phones, their limited capacity forcing painful choices about what to preserve. The most damning documents were photographed and encrypted, the twins' fingers stiff with cold as they typed passcodes that combined childhood numbers and fragments of street names only they would recognize. The tapes were too bulky to carry all at once, so they selected the ones that contained the clearest voices, the names that still resonated in the city, the moments when the bureaucracy of cruelty revealed itself most plainly. They did not trust any single rote or recipient. Instead, they created a scattering of contingencies, burying one set of copies in a hollow beneath a fallen log far from the cabin, slipping another into a waterproof pouch they taped inside the lining of a coat. The journalist they had contacted was given only a fraction of what they possessed, enough to confirm the magnitude of the story, but not enough to compromise the rest if something went wrong. When the storm clouds began to gather again, they took it as a sign rather than an obstacle. Heavy snow erased tracks, muffled sound, blurred the lines between forest and sky. It was dangerous to travel in such conditions, but it was also the only camouflage they could count on. They locked the cabin not because they expected it to remain untouched, but because the act itself felt like closing a chapter. They split up at the edge of the clearing, a decision that hollowed out their chests even as it increased their chances. One brother headed toward the old logging road that cut east through the hills, the pouch heavy inside his coat, his head bent against the wind. The other veered south, following a path that existed only in memory and intuition, a series of landmarks he had memorized during their months of isolation. Neither looked back. They had learned that hesitation was more dangerous than fear. The forest closed around them with the intimacy of a living thing. Snow clogged their boots. The cold gnawed through layers of clothing until every step felt like a betrayal by the body itself. At one point, the brother moving east heard the distant growl of an engine behind him, too far away to identify but close enough to quicken his pace until his lungs burned. He ducked into a stand of trees, pressing himself against a trunk as the sound passed without slowing, leaving only the echo of its presence. The southern route was no kinder. The other brother slipped on a patch of ice and tumbled down a shallow ravine, his shoulder striking rock with a force that left him gasping. For a long moment, he lay there staring at the blurred canopy above, convinced that this was where the story would end, not with revelation but with a quiet freezing that would be reported, if at all, as another unfortunate accident. The thought of the names in the archive pulled him upright. He forced himself back to his feet, the pain sharp enough to keep him alert. They converged on the outskirts of town from different directions, the storm breaking just enough to reveal the familiar outline of buildings that had once felt like home. The journalist's contact had given them a location not far from the old courthouse, a place that traded in anonymity and late hours. One brother arrived first, slipping through the back door of a laundromat that never seemed to close, passing the envelope to a woman who met his eyes with a steadiness he had not encountered in weeks. She did not ask questions. She did not promise safety. She simply took the package and disappeared into a maze of humming machines. The other brother did not reach his destination so easily. He was halfway down the block when a car rolled to a stop beside him, its window lowering just enough to reveal a face he recognized from the documents. The man did not threaten or plead. He spoke as if this were a business meeting that had simply been delayed, suggesting figures that would have changed the twins' lives overnight. For a heartbeat, the offer hung in the air, as tangible as the cold. Then the brother thought of the cabin, of the warm patch in the floor that had whispered of buried truths, of the tapes that carried voices no one else would ever hear if he accepted this deal. He ran. The chase was brief and brutal, boots slipping on slush, horns blaring as he burst into traffic without looking. He did not stop until he reached the shelter of a community center whose doors were propped open for a winter clothing drive, thrusting the memory card into the hands of a volunteer who looked more startled than alarmed. He did not explain. He did not need to. The moment he let go, the weight he had been carrying for months shifted, dispersing into a world that could no longer pretend it did not exist. The fallout was not immediate, but it was inevitable. Within days, the journalist's first article appeared, cautious in tone but explosive in content. Names were withheld at first, but the shape of the story was unmistakable. The city reacted with disbelief, then anger, then a frantic rush to control the narrative. Officials denied involvement. Spokespeople offered statements that said everything and nothing. Families of the vanished came forward with their own fragments of memory, their own questions that had gone unanswered for too long. The twins did not stay to watch the storm they had unleashed. They left town before dawn one morning, the car they had borrowed rattling under the weight of everything they had chosen not to abandon. The cabin receded into the trees behind them, a sliver of geometry swallowed by winter, no longer a joke shared online but a fulcrum upon which the city's history had turned. They did not know where they would end up, only that the road ahead belonged to them in a way the one behind never had. The cold would follow, and the danger, and the consequences of telling a truth that had been buried with such care. But, for the first time since the factory's siren fell silent, they were not being carried by the current of someone else's design. They were moving under their own power, leaving behind a past that had finally been forced into the light. If this story moved you, don't stop here. Subscribe to the channel right now so you won't miss the next chapter or the other stories we're releasing soon. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it today,